Hey, welcome back to Linode. My name is Austin Gill, and in this series we are building full stack applications with Remix, Prisma, and SQL databases. We've talked about some nice user experience improvements, so let's keep on that train. And I think one thing that would be cool is right now we're kind of hard coding the sort order. And if you notice, there's not a whole lot of logical sense to it. I guess we have Nugget first, and he's like really awesome, but I don't think these are exactly sorted by awesomeness. In fact, they're sorted by the order that they were put in. So Nugget is first, and then Kevin, and then Nemo, and that's because their IDs are actually in lexical sorting order. And all that really means is that they're in alphabetical order, the IDs, and because of that, they are sorted from the first entry to the last entry. Now, we may want to change that so that the last one is first, or the most recent entry is what we see first, or maybe the most recently updated entry is what we see first. Or we may want to give users the ability to decide which sort order to take. Like you may want alphabetical order based on the name and be able to reverse that. So we'll look at doing that next. Now, up in our SQL command, or our SQL query, we can start to modify how the order works using the order by keywords. And what we do with order by is we pass the column name, so column, and we pass the direction, which can either be ascending or descending. So if we look at a quick little database connection, I've got this database plugin in VS Code, and I've connected to my little local NPM database, so I can see all of the pets in the database. Okay, so we've got our table, our pet table here, and we can see that the pets are listed. We're selecting all of the columns from the pet table, and we're just getting the first 100. So we can see we've got Nugget, Kevin, Nemo, Bugs, and we have them ordered. By default, it's going to order based on the primary key, which is this ID. This ID is using a CUID, which is lexigraphically sortable, which basically means alphanumerically it can be sorted. So we want to change that so that we can order it in a different order, let's say by the name. So we can say select all from pet, order by, and then we'll use the name column, and we'll set the order to ascending. So now we see that we've got Ariel, Bagheera, Bugs, Courage. Looks good. That's about the order I would expect it in. And if we go to descending, we can see we've got Yoshi, Tweety, Spunky, Roger, Rango, Ponyo. So that's essentially the syntax that we're looking for. So I actually kind of put that in the wrong place. Technically, that would have to go before the limit and offset. There you go, something like that. But we want to accomplish the same thing with Prisma. So fortunately, we have the order by attribute that we can add. And because we're going to keep the order roughly the same and it's not going to impact the count, we can actually just pass that on to the default parameters. So we can say order by, and that's going to take an object, and we can use the column name as the property. So I'm going to say name, and then we'll pass in ascending. So now if we look at our results, we see that Ariel is first, and we've got Nugget here at the end, and at the very bottom of the list we've got Yoshi. Great. And again, if we set that to descending, we see Yoshi first and then Tweety. So I'm going to go ahead and build the rest of this, but we'll start with the UI and then we'll tackle actually adding this logic in later. So the way I'm picturing this is maybe we have like a little modifier inputs down here that say, users can select what they want to order by. Maybe they can select the name and then set it to ascending or descending, or they can use the most recently updated, and maybe we can default to that. Okay, so inside of our component in the template, we're going to add a couple more inputs. Now, I'm not going to use the input component on these because I want to do something a little bit more from scratch. So I'm gonna start with, well, let's start with a label. It's always a good idea. So we're gonna do a label, and we're gonna say sort by, and then I need to give this an ID. So I'm gonna give this an HTML4 attribute. And this is going to match the ID on the select that we're going to be using. So this is going to be sort by, sure. And then we'll add a select, and we'll say the name is sort by, and the ID is sort by. And then inside of there, we're going to have two options, option times 2. And this first one is going to be name, and it's going to be sort by name, and then updated at and updated. Great. Now, if we look at this, we should see exactly that. We have the input, and then we have our sort by here, and then we have our search button. Now, I think it would be nicer if this sort by were actually below the almost full width input and then the search button. So I'm going to change that. Technically, you might want to pull this below this button, but that's not actually what I want to do because the order in the DOM actually matters, especially if you are using a keyboard. So with a keyboard, we want it to go search and then sort by and then the actual search button. So to accomplish that, we leave them in the DOM order that they are, but we're going to wrap that in a div, and then we're going to give that a class name equal to order1. And because that order1 is going to apply an order property on this div, and these other two elements don't have an order property inside of this flex container, this is going to be at the end. Okay, now we almost have it in the right spot. So we'll do order1, and then we'll do width full. That'll make it full width, take up the entire width of that flex container. But for it to actually wrap, I want this to say flex wrap. There we go. Okay, cool. Got it where I want it. Let's do a little bit of styling here. This form now has a flex container with more gap than I want on the vertical thing. So I think we have to actually change that gap. So instead of gap 4, I want the gap on the x-axis to be 4, and I want the gap on the y-axis to be a little bit tighter. So let's do gap 2 or gap y 2. So let's see how that looks. That's gonna break my CSS, so I have to restart my dev server. And that should work when we get it back online. Okay, so we reload and we've got it a little bit closer, more like what I was hoping for. So let's see what else I can do. I'm going to actually turn this div into its own little flex container with its own little gap of 2 so that the label and the select are a little bit spaced out. And then I'm gonna give the select some styles. Class name is going to equal border 0. And then we'll do padding 0. I'm actually gonna give this a little colon. Look at that. And now we've got sort by name and updated. And we just need a background. Background transparent. And I think that's looking pretty good. Not super obvious that that's a select. Maybe instead of the border 0, we can just get rid of the padding and see how that looks. Okay, that's looking a little better. So now I'm also actually going to do the same thing with the direction. And because I have both of those in their own divs, I actually want to put this onto its own line in its own div as well. So we're gonna wrap that in a div, and I'm gonna copy some of this. over here, which means, oops, get rid of that. And this order, okay. I think that gets us where we want, and then we'll do the sort by and the direction. I just realized I had this called sorty by. Sorty, 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 sort. There we go. Sort direction, we've got ascending and descending. And then this will be ASC. This will be DESC, and sort by is going to be changed to sort dir. Cool, looking good. Let's also make this a flex. Let's give this a gap of something a bit larger. Okay, so now if someone comes to the application, they can do a search and they can change the sort by and the sort direction if they want to updated and ascending or descending, and then they can hit search. Now, I think that that's okay for the UI. I'm going to move on to the backend now. So we know that the parameters that we're expecting are going to be called sort by and sort dir based on the name of these inputs. And we just need to map those to our order by property here. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the default value for both of those, in which case I'm going to set the default to be updated at, and then descending is probably all right. That way we see the most recent addition first, and this looks right to me. Okay, so kind of similar to how we did the search, we're going to do the order. So we're going to say query.get, and what did I call it down here? Sort by. So we can either call it sort by or order by. I think in my case, I'm actually gonna call these in the markup order by, but I'll let the user see sort by because that's maybe just personal preference. And I want the text to be intuitive for the user, but you know, we can use, the robots can understand more complicated things. Or you can do a transformation up here. But I'm just going to go ahead and say if the query dot order by is defined, then I'm going to overwrite what this default is. So I'm going to say options dot order by equals an object, and we'll say that the order by value or property is whatever that value was. So we can even say something like const order by equals query.get order by, and we'll assign that property there. And then we can say that the order direction is going to be whatever we pull from here, and we can just default to something like ascending. So we don't necessarily know. We'll leave it as ascending, and that should be good. Now we don't need to update the count option, so we can just get rid of that line, and I think that that solves it. So now if I go here and I leave it as name and I search, we do see that we are loading the results in ascending order by name. And if we change this to descending order and hit search, we see that we have it in opposite order. Now, if we go to updated in descending, we see the most recent at the top of the list. And if we do updated in ascending order, we see the oldest or the last updated. Now, just for tests, let's see if we update this pet and we go back home, we see the order from updated in descending order. So this is the most recently updated. So this is actually working correct. Now we actually want to do a little bit of a nicer feature where we want to set what these values are, if they are defined or not. So we need to check if those values exist in the query string parameters, and if so, select the default selected value. So I'm going to go here, grab this ID, highlight the next entry, grab the name, and then come over here at the end and say default value equals search params dot get, and we'll pass in that property. And if not, we'll fall back to the default value, which for order by is going to be updated, string of updated at, and for the direction, I believe it is descending. Okay, we reload the page. We see that there's no query string parameter set. We can see that it's sort by updated by default and descending, but those can be set to name and ascending as well. So if we set it to name and we do a search, we can see that we're on name descending. We can even reload the page and that will still be the case. And we can even do a search. And now all of the original search strings are applied to the UI, even if we reload or if we were to send this URL to someone else. So now we've got a pretty cool application with some nice features actually. We've got searching and filtering and sorting and pagination, but there's one little usability issue that I would like to fix. If we look at the application, we can see that the sort by and direction are set when the page loads, and we can modify those. I can change to name and click search. Now, it would be kind of a nicer user experience if instead of having to click search, it just kind of changes as I make that change myself. So let's implement that next. So in my front end code down in the template, we're going to need to add an event listener. Now I could add the same event listener to both of these select options and say whenever these change, we'll just programmatically submit that form. But I think it might actually be nice to also capture changes on the input state. So to capture all three in one, we're going to add an event listener to the form. So we'll say when the form has an on change event, we want to capture that. And we'll call it handle change. Now let's start by just defining that function. So I'll actually put that up here and we'll say const handle change is going to equal a function that takes that event and just logs it for now. Now if we open up our dev tools again, and go to the console, I can see that anytime that I make a change here, or when I type in here, we see those events. Okay, so the trick now is when we experience that change event, we actually want to submit the form associated with that event. So if we go here, we need to programmatically submit that event. Now we could capture the form DOM node off of the event current target and use the submit event or the submit method. But then we wouldn't be taking advantage of all of the built-in features that Remix provides from us that we've explored before. So let's do that programmatically with a hook called use submit. So we're going to say const submit is going to equal use submit. And I hope that that came in. Nope, doesn't look like it did. So use submit. Okay, and that is going to expect a DOM node. So instead of console logging the event, we're going to submit the event.current target. So now we have that same event handler, but it's going to submit this event. So now if we open up the DOM or the network, we can see when we change this, we do get a new network request. And if we change ascending or descending to ascending, we get a different network request that makes those changes. Now that's great, except we've also introduced kind of a new bug into our system, because now if I type into this search field, we'll see a couple of interesting things happen. One, all of those requests kind of fired off with each character that I typed, which is kind of a problem because as I'm typing, I may not actually want to kick off all those events. Now, fortunately, this is another thing that Remix does for us that's really a handy feature, is if it sees a lot of the same requests being sent out to the same API, it will actually cancel those requests for us. Now, why is it actually cool that Remix is canceling these requests? It's cool because every time that we're making these fetch requests, those are returning promises. And eventually the logic will resolve with those promises and we can do something with the results. Now, the problem happens when two fetches go out one after another, and then you get into a race condition. So it's possible that a request can be initiated first, and then a second request can be initiated, and the second request actually resolves before the first. And in that case, your logic may actually deal with the first request second and show invalid or inconsistent results on the front end. So it's much nicer when a fetch request gets canceled if it's essentially stale and we only get the fresh data here. Now you may be thinking, hey, that's pretty cool. I may not have actually built that into the app myself. And that is pretty cool, but our job is not done because unfortunately this only reflects on the front end. If we go into the back end and we check out the work that's being done, we can say, do something like console log doing some work. We'll see something a little bit interesting if we try those requests again. So now if I clear this request out and I type this one more time, nugget, we will see all of those original requests being canceled and only the last one is actually getting through. But as far as our backend is concerned, we're seeing a whole bunch of queries and a whole bunch of doing some work. So ideally, if we're not even going to use the response from those, we don't even want to send them, right? We only want to use, we want to avoid doing extra work that we don't need to. And that's where a client-side debounce comes in. So if you don't know what a debounce is, that's okay. I'm going to explain it in a moment, but it's going to make a little bit more sense after we've already implemented. So we're going to write the code first and then walk through it. So first and foremost, I am going to import a utility from my utils file, utils.js. We're going to import a utility called Debounce. Now, Debounce is a higher order function that expects another function. So now instead of having this handle change that passes the event current target to the submit directly, we're actually going to capture this submit logic into a debounced function. So we're going to say, take that out, and we're going to say debounced submit with the event.current target. And what is debounced submit going to be? Debounced submit is going to be a function that takes a form and calls that submit event on the form. But we're not just going to pass it to that function, we're actually going to wrap that inside of this debounce function. And this debounce function expects some sort of like callback function. And then as the second parameter, it expects some sort of threshold. So what this function is going to be, it's a function that will eventually call this after this 300 millisecond threshold has been called. But if this function tries to be executed more than once within that 300 millisecond threshold, it's going to postpone or essentially reset that timer back to 0, and it's going to look for another 300 milliseconds. And if it gets called again, it's going to reset the timer and wait another 300 milliseconds. So that ultimately this function is only ever going to be called once by the end of that chain of executions. So what does that look like? Well, if we look at our network requests and we make a change, we see that there's a little bit of delay, but then our request is sent. And if we make another change, we see once again that our request is sent. Not a big issue. Now, when we actually start typing though, if we type quickly enough, we can see I'm typing. There's not a whole lot. There's no request going on unless I actually take some time and give it 300 milliseconds to exceed that threshold, and then it'll call that function. So now we can do something like do a search for nugget, and then we only do one request. So then where we're actually doing some work, we only see it once, and then our query is completed. So that is going to save our backend from being spammed with a whole bunch of extra work that it doesn't actually need to do. In the next video, we're going to actually be deploying this application. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button if you like the work that we did. And in the next video, we are going to be deploying to Linode. So if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to sign up with a link in the description, and you can get $100 in free credit for the next 60 days to check out all of Linode's awesome products.